So welcome everybody. Welcome to the online participants. Good afternoon in Europe. Good morning in North America, and a special welcome to our speakers. Today's topic in this series of roundtables on Nordic issues, to which Kelly McCowan took the initiative, and Helena Wolf and I are co-organizing. Today's topic is the Nordics and the environment. We've sent around a few questions. We will probably not be able to discuss all of them because we've just got an hour and a half, which I think is just about right. I mean, since this is online, an hour and a half is actually quite long. So we try to make this an event which is tight but loose. You know, tight in the sense that we try to focus on the specifically Nordic relationships to the environment. Maybe asking some questions about whether there is a Nordic pattern, whether there are divergences, whether there are interesting contrasts, and whether there is something which is Nordic about ways of relating to the environment. Looking at some of the contradictions, some of the challenges, and so on and so forth. So that's a tight bit of it. The loose bit of it is that we want this to be like a roundtable conversation, as if we were in the same room and going out afterwards for a coffee or a beer. So the way we're going to go about this is that the 5 speakers will have up to 3 minutes each to make an opening statement on issues that are on their mind, concerns, things that we should focus on, and maybe, if they want to, about their own work. Following which we'll have some exchange between the panel participants before we open up for questions and comments from the audience. So my name is Thomas Eriksen. I'm an anthropologist at the University of Oslo. And I can't, you know, if I were to sort of be just to all the speakers and introduce them properly, I'd probably spend half an hour doing so. And so I'm not going to do that. Okay, they may introduce themselves a bit if they want to, but I'll say who they are. So Dominic is at Rice University and has for years done very significant work and directed transdisciplinary research on climate and the environment. And he's currently looking at the forms of electricity provision. Has a recent monograph out, well, actually it's a duograph, I'm coming to that in a minute, but he's got a recent monograph out on wind power in Mexico. Steffen Dalsgaard from the IT University in Copenhagen, also, like several of us, I guess, came around to these issues in recent years and has done work on leadership and politics in Papua New Guinea before. And is now looking at ways in which we try to measure and control and produce knowledge about various aspects to do with climate. He's been writing about carbon, you know, carbon as a value, CO2 as a value, and is also looking at, among other things, cultural meanings of air quality. How do you measure the quality of the air, and how do we come to ways of looking at the quality of the air? Quentin Gausset is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Copenhagen. And he's been at this for quite some time, been interested in green activism for quite a few years, and co-edited a book that came out only last year called The Role of Non-State Actors in the Green Transition. And so he's looking at sustainability, activism, has also worked around the world, but I think you're now mainly working in Denmark, if I'm not mistaken. Rasmus Rodineliussen, a Swedish PhD student with, to me, sounds like a very Danish name, okay? Works on marine debris from a Swedish context and is looking at divers and pollution. Swedish divers who are going to clean lakes and waters around Stockholm from marine debris, and how this works. And finally, Cymene Howe is also an anthropologist at Rice University, and she is the author of the other part of the duograph. Very creative. I think others should do the same thing from Mexico on wind power, and her work takes on, probably, I would say to a greater extent than Dominic the question of the multi-species, the broader, what in German we call the Umwelt, the environment in a broad sense. And she also works in many genres. They've both been making podcasts, blogs, and so on. And Cymene is, I think, the main person behind the film Not Okay, a little movie about a small glacier at the end of the world from her work in Iceland. I hope I haven't forgotten anybody. There are so many of you, but let's get started. So Dominic, would you start with an opening statement, please?
Sure. Actually, I was going to suggest, Cymene, did you want to show a couple slides so we could do you first and then I can follow up?
Yeah, that works. Should I just take my little intro time here?
Yep.
Thank you, Tomas, for the wonderful introductions, and thank you to Helena and Kelly and Tomas for organizing this fantastic event. So what I wanted to do is just pop up a couple of slides very quickly for you, which I'll do right here. Get this going. There, can everyone see that? Yes, it's just a blank slide for now. So I wanted to begin by, and I liked, Thomas, that you started us off with this idea of what is the Nordicness of Nordic anthropology, because one of the themes I wanted to begin with was thinking about the methodologies that we employ in looking at the Nordic context. And one point I wanted to make to begin with was to advocate for public-facing and publicly engaged projects. That is, projects that reach beyond our comfortable academic spaces where we normally publish and write. So in 2016, I began a project in Iceland about the loss of ice and the consequences of melting in that country, the loss of cryospheres. And that came to life in the short documentary that Tomas mentioned about the first of Iceland's glaciers to be lost to climate change, a little documentary. And then the next thing that came out of that film was a plaque that Dominic and I did together with two Icelandic colleagues, really, a scientist and a poet, where we created this memorial, which was, it turned out, the first memorial to a glacier fallen to climate change. And here you see the plaque on the stone, written first in Icelandic and then in English, a kind of letter to the future. And this is in some ways a kind of connection to landscape, to identity, and to memory. But it's also a way of creating recognition and connections to other places around the world that might not necessarily attune to what is happening in Iceland. The press picked up on this plaque quite heavily in the summer of 2019. And so it was a way of translating that research into something more public facing that did have fairly large public recognition. And I think that these are important moves for us to make as we're doing our research in the Nordic context. So one of the other points I wanted to make just in starting out is that thinking through these connectivities, the physical, the social, and the future-facing interconnections that we can find, whether those are scientific collaborations and networks, whether they're shared infrastructures between Nordic countries and the non-Nordic countries, sensing technologies that link the Nordic region to the lower latitudes. And so this is an image from a NASA device that I'm using in my current project that's called Melt and Rise. And it's a gradient fingerprint mapping device, a climate modeling tool that allows you to see the distribution of melted ice and how it becomes sea level rise in 300 of the world's coastal cities. And so here is a calculation for one of my field sites, Honolulu, Hawaii, which is, it turns out, the city in the United States that is most affected by Greenlandic melt. And the other two sites are Iceland and Cape Town, South Africa, which you also see here on the gradient fingerprint map. And here you can see the distribution of the glacial basins. And if you look in the right-hand corner, you see that several of these glacial basins are, of course, in the Nordic region. And so this can calculate exactly the loss of ice and how it becomes sea level rise in these coastal cities. And so I think that this is a good example of these sort of new watery connectivities that we have in times of climate change and in anthropogenic impact. And so I'm thinking of these watery connectivities between melting ice and rising seas as a kind of hydrological globalization. And out of this will also come another public facing project, which I'm calling Sibling Cities of the Anthropocene. And I see I'm out of time, so I will pause and thank you and pass the baton on to Dominic. Are you going next?
Yeah, I'll just follow up briefly. So I just wanted to say that, so in addition to being involved with these projects that Cymene is working on, my own sort of point of entry into the Nordic world came sort of unexpectedly through tracing politics and satire, and particularly the case of Jon Gunnar and Besti Flokkurin in Iceland. And this was this case of how out of this condition of economic collapse in Iceland, you know, the largest per capita banking collapse in human history, that a political revolution of sorts took place that was both beautiful and bizarre, both ridiculous and sincere at the same time. And I found it inspirational for thinking about climate problems today, because people always say the problem, you know, is that, you know, politics is the art of the possible, and that of course suggests very strongly that we will continue to move on the rails that we've already laid. But I think the case of the Best Party shows in some ways how you can change what's possible. You can do things that are wholly unexpected, especially in times of crisis. And sometimes those things go in terrible ways, but sometimes they go in ways that are, I think, quite inspiring and beautiful, as I said. So, you know, generally speaking, my work is on energy and politics. That's really my interest. And I think this is obviously a topic that has a great deal of resonance and connection to what's happening in Nordic countries today. I'm interested in sort of this intersection between energy and politics, as well as imagined future making in Nordic countries. And out of the Okkjökull Memorial, you know, we had some interesting conversations with the Prime Minister of Iceland and some other sort of leading political and cultural figures in Iceland. And at this moment, the Danish Icelandic artist Ólafur Eliasson, you know, had a very passionate speech at this sort of assembly of Icelandic politicians, where he said the Nordic countries need to step up and become the sort of guiding light for the world, because there's a leadership vacuum around climate, and who else, you know, who's better positioned to do this than the Nordic countries, because of course they have front row seats to all of the effects of climate change, as well as having, you know, a history of engagement with these issues. That of course, you know, we can't be too romanticize it too much. There are all sorts of issues, as Thomas has himself noted, the enduring petro-state and petro-modern legacies of countries like Norway and Iceland, the problems of sort of emissions outsourcing and green mirages, as they say, in countries like Sweden and Denmark. So the real questions, I think, and challenges about how a distinctive Nordic eco-politics could take shape. And yet I do think there's something there. I mean, you know, you could argue that Greta Thunberg could have come from anywhere, but she didn't, you know. And so I think there is something about, especially the youth movements, the climate movements, that I think are incredibly important in terms of pressing the issue of the necessity, the existential necessity of drastic action, of civilization reforming action at this time. And I do think that, you know, there are some questions that, again, I think many of you have thought about. In other words, how long can this sort of pursuit of sustainable modernity continue in a time of increasing climate displacement, of refugeeism, of a rise in sort of folkish nationalist sentiments in privileged nations across the world? You know, how long can we keep sort of a good modernity going before the borders begin to fall and the walls begin to go up? But I do think that this is an area in which the Nordic countries are front and center. I believe that the politics of the future are being made in the Nordic world right now. And so I think it's an absolutely vital place to engage problems of environment and indeed, you know, sort of civilizational future today.
Thanks a lot, both of you. Fantastic. I mean, there are so many things already we could talk about, but I'll pass the floor quickly on to Quentin. Would you like to say a few words?
Yes, thank you. I would like to take as point of departure what Cymene said, like, we know the problem and we know what's to be done, but what needs to be done at very different level. And there is the government, the international community, then there is the citizen level as well. And this is the level I'm studying in my research, my latest research. So I'm looking at how collective movements impact on behavior change. And my statement there is to say that I feel a frustration as an anthropologist because the field is dominated by psychologists and by economists. These are the guys providing theories on behavior change, and other social scientists have totally given up on that. And what I miss is the collective dimension of behavior change. And this is what I've been studying through green associations. So we've made a big survey showing that members of green associations in Denmark, like eco-villages or food cooperative, have a carbon footprint that is 40% below average, which is huge. It's where we need to be in 10, 15 years from now. So they are there effortlessly, without any subsidies, just by their own will and their own organization. So I've been studying also how they bring their what they do differently from other people, and there are 4 points that come to the front. First is that is the infrastructure thing. Like when they join forces, they are stronger together and they can afford things that individuals cannot afford, such as their own carbon neutral district heating system or sewage system or car sharing or this type of thing. So that's one thing. Second point is the social organization. They are members of different working groups. So they specialize on chicken or collective meals or energy or transport, etc. And then instead of having to take superficial decision on everything, they can specialize on very specific topics and take very well-informed, in-depth decisions for the rest of the community. That means that they actually gain a lot. I mean, they are much more sustainable than what individuals would have done if they were alone with struggling with all these problems. The third point is the knowledge sharing and good sharing. So people are sharing knowledge all the time through collective meals or with their neighbors. They're sharing goods as well. There is always an exchange room where they can drop their used clothes, or they can borrow tools from one another. They can exchange on Facebook pages and all that. So there is a lot of exchange all around on an informal basis. And then the fourth point and latest is the collective identity. So people feel motivated, they are inspired by one another, and they feel a lot of energy. They feel empowered by the group and have a lot of motivation to change. And it's not something that comes through peer pressure, surprisingly. It comes really from role modeling. So people are not predicating and telling each other that they are doing not enough or not good. They are actually very careful not to blame others, but they are just trying to be themselves and to be the best as they can. And this is inspiring others to follow the lead. So I think I'm stopping there.
Thanks a lot, Quentin. We'll continue on that track later on, I'm sure, because there are some interesting convergences here between what you say and what the others have already said that we might want to explore. So Steffen, please.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you for the summary of what I've done and the others have done. Taking my lead from that, I am at the moment curious, as you know, also about how things are developing in a Nordic country, Denmark. Being located here, my perspective on environmental issues is, of course, shaped by current discussions. And as I think Dominic stated, I mean, is there a Nordic model for how to go forward? And the Danish government has, maybe known to many of you, stated that 70% reduction in emissions compared to a 1990 baseline is the goal that they want to achieve by 2030. That, of course, is an ambitious thing, but what does it mean in practice? And that's sort of where we, at least in Danish universities, are being dragged into those debates and involved in. And it kind of leads me to notice how that is conflated to another very big debate where Denmark at least tries to be at the forefront of, sort of globally be at the forefront, which is digitalization, which is the role of the IT industry. So being, of course, at an IT university, I also feel I have a very privileged position to understand how climate and IT is interrelated, and how especially the IT industry is presented as kind of a savior, as the thing that can help us do what I think the key term is really circulating in my head right now is decoupling. How is this decoupled? But then what does that term mean? I mean, that's sort of what I'm trying to pursue at the moment, at least through literature, and hopefully in the future with some of my colleagues. And also empirically, how does that decoupling play out in practice? So that's sort of where I am at, and maybe something we'll also be all seeing more to.
Yes. Thanks very much, Steffen. Yes, indeed. Is green growth possible? I mean, that's one of the key questions, isn't it? When we look at global capitalism and the art of the possible, which we tend to think of as politics. So thanks very much. So Rasmus, at the end, the floor is yours. Well, not at the end, but at the end of the beginning.
Thank you, Thomas, and thanks for the invitation to join this. This is really interesting. I will start off with what I'm doing. I mainly work with two groups of trash scuba divers and marine scientists. And they both engage the Baltic Sea and Lake Mälaren in a quest to understand how anthropogenic practice of wasting has altered this water until today and into the future. And the marine scientists, they look at the impact from excessive nutrients leaking from society into water and putting this in a context of climate change. I have joined the scientists both on the sampling expeditions and followed them and their samples to the laboratories to see how they have interacted with the samples and with the microorganisms within. And then the scuba divers work with a hands-on initiative to remove waste such as batteries and car tires from the water around Stockholm, and doing some main raise awareness and put pressure on the government to react against the issue of marine waste. And I have taken part in cleanup activities and dived with them and joined them in the outreach campaigns. For example, they built a large replica of the Stockholm City Hall in trash last summer. And during Christmas, they also built a replica of the well-known Gävlebocken, with the god name of the dam goat. It's a big goat in trash. And to situate my work, I want to take a look at a statement from Stockholm Water Authority's webpage, which is saying that imagining this dirty Stockholm today is hard when you look out over Stockholm's clean water, a hot summer day, clean water with a history of hard work. And this is told in a relationship to the history of Stockholm as being a very filthy town, with most and all waste produced being thrown right out the window. And during summer, these dishes of mostly liquid waste dried up and produced the most horrible smell. But it was not until the 1900s that Stockholm got its first wastewater treatment plant, and things started to develop and get better and start looking at Stockholm as today. So both groups engage with showing politicians and the public that the water is under severe stress, and that something has to be done now, that the history of hard work mentioned in the statement is not so much a history as it is a current requirement to actually get to work and for a future of clean water. So interestingly, not long ago, in 1964, the government issued an instructional video direct asking people on holiday to get rid of the waste by disposing of it in water. And in the video, it is shown how to make sure that the waste actually sinks to the bottom, and all in order not to impact the beautiful nature around. And this is something that the local people both remember and have forgotten about. For when spectators walk by a large pile of waste brought up from the water, they often react with a loud voice like, how can somebody be this stupid to actually throw all of this in the water? But then oftentimes with a more silent, like a whisper, they're telling you that stories about when they're remembering how they went out in a small boat in the night and you were sinking washing machines and all this kind of stuff in the water at the time before when I didn't know better. So this is where I wanted to start off a little bit, to situate it with a historical example and how these divers and the scientists trying to lift this issue up to the surface again and do something about it.
Great, thank you. Yes, I think that's also a track that we might pursue if we have the chance and if people are inclined to do it. The way in which nature suddenly appeared in politics was translated from something physical, analog, out there into documents and regulations and so on. But I'd like to start maybe with Denmark. I mean, Dominic says that perhaps Scandinavia and the Nordic countries can be at the forefront of making a difference when it comes to dealing in a constructive way with the climate issue. And Steffen says that, well, the Danish government has some fairly hairy objectives. I mean, about reducing emissions by 70% within 10 years. And Quentin writes about and studies grassroots movements, activists from below. So there is something here about scale and social distance that I think we might begin to talk about, which characterizes the Nordic countries as opposed to countries like France or India or the United States, where the social distance is much, much greater. Maybe you would comment on this, Quentin. I mean, to what extent are grassroots organizations and activist groups being heard in Denmark? Because presumably many of them have good contact with politicians. You know, I mean, Dominic and Cymene spoke with the Icelandic Prime Minister. Well, you know, Iceland is much smaller, but even so, social distance in Denmark is also much shorter than in Germany or France.
Yes, it's true. I mean, people working in green associations are also getting involved in politics, in local politics at the municipal level, etc. For a very practical reason, if you want to create a new eco-village, you have to talk to the municipality. It's complicated. You have to, to make a deal. You have to find ways of, and then because you cannot really change it from the outside, you get involved into politics to change it from the inside. But I don't know, I can feel in Denmark something is changing, like there is a wave of vegetarianism, for example. So we are reaching, in some aspects, tipping points, which makes that the default is changing from meat eating to vegetarian meals, for example, at university, for example, or elsewhere. And I can, and that's where I think those movements, those collective green associations have had an influence, because they have always been role model, being at the forefront of society. They were the first to have organic farming. They were the first to have wind turbines. They were the first to try the ecological sewage system. They are always at the forefront trying the newest things, and they are making the experiences. And if it is successful, it can spread out to the rest of society. So I really like the organic certifying system in Denmark actually originates from eco-villages that have been designing that 10 years before the government took over. So there is a spillover effect, but it's very difficult to document anthropologically or even with any method, because those things are hidden in the everyday political interactions, and it's not a big bang, it's not a big demonstration. We are talking about micro-activism in our research project. It's everyday type of activism that together makes a huge difference, but it's very difficult to document.
Sorry, I forgot to say, I mean, if any of the other panelists want to jump in, feel free to do so. I mean, just take the floor and speak, or you may use the Zoom functions with which we've all become very familiar in the last year. Raise your hand, or even use the chat, or just raise your hand like this. So please do go ahead and do so. Yes. So Steffen has already raised his hand. Steffen.
Now that you mentioned Denmark, I should probably jump in. I think what we asked reminded me of research that's also happened in Norway with Kaja Nørgaard's research, Living in Denial, on how people think about their role in climate change and sort of the awareness that we know that's happening, but what do we do about it? I mean, what is our individual responsibilities? And I think, as Quentin, I'm also frustrated by the stress on individualism, and that also comes with the Silicon Valley dreams, libertarianism, liberalism, too much stress on what the individual should handle. But there is that sort of I would say excuse or form of practical denial or strategic denial sometimes, that we're small countries. I mean, the exceptionalism goes both ways. We're not just running at the forefront, we're also small. So our footprint is really small compared to the rest of the world. What can we do? What difference can we really make? So that sort of struggle going on, and as Quentin says, I think there's it's moved a lot over the last 10 years, but I think the positions are still the same, and I still sort of see really a struggle between these very different ways of approaching it and very different ways of thinking about what the solutions are, whether it should be individual choice, whether it should be market, whether it should be technological solutionism saving us, or whether it should be the communal, which I agree with Quentin is luckily also emerging as stronger now than it was before.
Yeah, during the pandemic, it seems as if the politicians in the Nordic countries have communicated in a different way from what they have in larger countries. Because they communicate as though they were you and me, they were our relatives. And that's why we're so disappointed in them when they break the rules themselves. So scale probably has something to do with it. But there are differences, and that is something that these countries have in common. You mentioned smallness, Steffen. With smallness also comes vulnerability. Yes, flexibility does, but also vulnerability. So I was wondering, I mean, Cymene, you've been working with volcanoes in Iceland. And as Dominic mentioned, Iceland is volatile in so many ways. You had this financial crisis, which blew the whole economy away, I mean, in a matter of a very short time. And then you have volcanic activity and also the smallness of the economy, the memory of the Cold War with the UK and so on. Is there a sense in which Icelanders feel this vulnerability now regarding climate?
I think that's an emerging sensibility. And in fact, just in the time that Dominic and I have been doing work in the country, I think we've seen a change in discourse among the sort of general Icelandic population that has gone from not exactly climate denial, but some questions or suspicions or an ability to kind of laugh about it, that has now become much more serious. And when we look at the loss of glaciers, which have been in the present quite prominent in terms of the national identity of the country, right? The land of fire and ice. And so much tourism is now predicated upon visiting those glaciers as this sort of charismatic kind of mega element, right? If we think about charismatic megafauna, that people go to the savannah to go see lions in the wild, here they're going to see these glaciers in the wild before they disappear, right? So there's a kind of interesting sort of necropolitics at work here around these glacial forms. And there's certainly a recognition among the Icelandic population about the value of these glaciers and their natural beauty, and of course their economic value, but also the fact that they're disappearing. And so there's a real attunement to the exaggerated way in which climate change and global warming is affecting Iceland and the Nordic countries combined. But there's also a real sense of collective capacity, both on the island, 1,200 years of living a pretty hard scrabble existence in a place that's not exactly amenable to human existence, and the need to collaborate with local partners, countries that are nearby, in order to survive in that place, not just in the struggling times in the medieval days, but also in the present in terms of the politics and economic relationships that exist there.
Yeah. Dominic?
I just want to follow on that, Thomas Cymene, just by saying that I think, we've seen, for example, in the struggle to preserve the Icelandic Highlands, one of our collaborators on the Ökjökull project, the writer Andri Snær Magnusson, who has a terrific new book out on time and water. I'm sure some of you have had a chance to look at it. He led a movement, in the 90s and the 2000s to try to preserve the Highlands that ultimately didn't work. And there were the sort of continued construction of hydroelectric installations that were very favored by, the sort of rural population in parts of Iceland. So even in a very small country, you still have some people who kind of have a frontier liberalist attitude, right? That's like the same thing you might find in small town Texas. Well, there's nothing else here, we might as well frack. So there's a bit of that in Iceland, but I do think, recently, under the current administration, you've seen now on the cusp of actually a major sort of national park creation that would actually, I think, really change the way Iceland related to the sort of the last really large remaining wilderness in Europe, and I think that's very exciting. So I will say one other small point is that in this debate around, in this right after the Ökjökull, and with all that media attention, there was a meeting of the Nordic countries together with Angela Merkel, and there was a big push from the kind of environmentalist left to say we should declare a climate emergency. The entire Nordic world should declare a climate emergency at once. And this is where I think the different countries of the Nordic world need to be differentiated. Everyone was worried about Norway, whether Norway would be on board for such a project, because of course Norway wealth, and the wealth is very much tied to petroleum, and we could argue about whether it's the best petrostate in the world or just the usual petrostate with a different, as Thomas said once, the vegetarians who run the butcher shop, right? So I don't know, but I want to throw that back to think about the different interests within the Nordic world that may not all align exactly on the eco-politics that are coming.
Yes, I mean, yes, we need to differentiate, and but there are some similarities that I think we should also exploit. But I for one think that the financial crisis would not have unfolded the way it did in Iceland had it been a farming society and not a fishing society. So there are some historical differences, and in some ways, Iceland is just a hardcore version of Norway. It's a place where Norwegian go if they're just too Norwegian for Norway. I mean, even more fish, more nature, fewer people, more expensive beer, more horrible weather, and so on. But yet it's different. So, Steffen.
Yeah, that actually points to another thing I thought about mentioning, which related to maybe what we might call Nordic exceptionalism, which is the idea that what we produce in the Nordic countries is purer than elsewhere. So our oil is purer, it has a lower carbon footprint. Our agriculture is purer, it has a much lower carbon footprint per produced unit, and so forth. I don't know if this relates to Sweden or Iceland as well. I guess Iceland with geothermal energy is also, maybe a case in point, but there is that sort of idea of Nordic purity, I think, which gets into this as well.
I was wondering about this sort of scaling up and scaling down. And I'd like to ask you that question, Rasmus, but maybe you have something else on your mind. Because one way of looking at environmental issues, we stay with this for a little while, and we move on to discussing some other things, I think. But one way of looking at this is by saying that initiative has come from below, you know, social movements, Greta Thunberg, cooperatives, eco-socialists, and so on, and they have to put pressure on the politicians. Whereas the opposite view is that, you know, politicians have to take responsibility, because people are never going to do it themselves, because they're consumerists and they are short-sighted, and so on and so forth. So one way of dealing with this is by trying to scale down climate to the environment. And I was wondering, I was going to ask you, Rasmus, if that is what those divers are doing. That instead of saying we can save the inland ice in Greenland, because you can't, at least we can save this river, this creek, this particular harbor area, and we can clean it. But maybe you wanted to comment on.
No, that was actually something close to what I wanted to talk about, because I think it's the divers that are trying, as you say, to try to scale down and make it more comprehensible and easier to touch. Because when you're keeping the discussion at this level all the time, ordinary people often feel like it's no way to do something. It feels hard. It's like your little actions won't affect anything. And that's why they're trying to really show people how much a small the group of people actually can do for the environment. And that way, trying to also to make the government to react on this and do more, and try to make it like a two-way street, so that it will come from both directions in a way. But it also, what I want to say is that this with the pure Nordic countries and this kind of stuff, that it's this discourse and this profile from the governmental side that they are doing everything in a very good environmental friendly way, and of course, compared to many other places, it can be quite clean in Nordic countries and so on, and good for environmental issues and so on. But there's still a lot of issues which is not covered, and which there are still things that needs to be addressed. And for example, with Sweden and with talking about all this clean water where you can swim and that we can drink the water easily and so on, then still we can pull up, just from the last year, the group pulled up 15 tons of car batteries from Mälaren and several hundred tons of other waste. And I mean, it's just a lot of toxic things going on, which the government doesn't want to address unless they're forced to do so. And that's why I think it's interesting to go work with the scales up and down. So it's a good question, Thomas.
Yeah, absolutely. And we need to look at those double binds, those dilemmas that we find ourselves in, and the double communication. So Quentin and then Cymene.
Yes, maybe one thing about Denmark is that it's taking pride in being a land of associations. So you have associations everywhere. It can be professional, it can be sports, it can be locality, it can be, you know, so everybody is a member of different associations, and politicians love these associations because they need some kind of political support, and they cannot deal with individuals, but they love to deal with civil society, because that's where they can gather easily supporters for whatever political project they have as well. So I think there is a dependency that we see between politicians who, I mean, I've had, you know, the former environmental minister visiting us at the university saying, you know, when I got minister, I thought that, yes, this is it, now I can make a difference, etc. And he realized he was powerless without the support of the population. He didn't have a mandate in his own government unless they could feel that there was a broad support for the kind of policy he was pushing for. So he was telling our students, you know, get involved in politics. You know, that matters. It makes a huge difference. And maybe in the Scandinavian country, it's easier, or people feel that they can make a better difference or more difference than in other countries, because the distance is shorter, because there is a bigger trust in the government. I don't know, because there are all these associations that are making the country you know, run smoothly, etc. I don't know exactly, but there is something, it's true in Denmark, that makes a difference, and that makes that people get involved into politics and make a big difference, actually. So, I mean, you don't need many people to make a huge difference in a country like Denmark.
And you mentioned earlier, Quentin, the the term of the tipping point, which is also something that we might look into. And what kind of tipping points do we see towards climate disaster or towards a fundamental change in ways of life and not just in views? That's interesting. So,
Can I say something about that?
Oh, sorry.
I wrote about fractal, and I think that the fractal is very important. It's when the structure is replicating itself at different levels of organization. And I think that if you want to reach a tipping point, you need to have it at all the different levels in society, from the bottom to the top. So that means that the politicians must move at the same pace as the citizens somehow, and at the civil society. And that's where, you have to create a movement. It's not just it's not something that happens from one day to the other. It's something that you build up over years and over political engagement, and you push in the right direction and you fight against those who push in the other direction. And at some point, something happens that, okay, it's consensual. It's like, the last elections in Denmark were about environment. It was not about unemployment. It was not about immigration. It was about the environment. And that's what made the difference in the vote. So that's
very interesting. And yes, and it happened, the tipping point was reached regarding slavery. So why not now? So Cymene, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really interesting, and it makes me think about how we can sort of operate outside the politics as usual framework. What are the innovative ways that we can examine as anthropologists or become engaged politically in routes outside of the kind of perfunctory normative structures of politics, like speaking with prime ministers or even social movements in some ways. And I was thinking, Thomas, you mentioned that we need to, that we can't save all of the glaciers or the ice sheet in Greenland and Iceland, but that we might, sort of save one river or one glacier to kind of localize it and bring the scale down in a really particular way. And to sort of bring the question of climate change down to the question of environment was another way that I think you phrased it, which I think is a really good way of thinking of it. And I'm thinking of these projects, thinking outside the politics as usual or normatively, and that is these programs in some places in the world. Aotearoa, New Zealand is one place, in the Himalaya region, in Nepal and India, and then also most recently in the state of Washington here in the United States, where they've taken particular rivers and particular glaciers and given them personhood status, legal personhood status, as an operative, with legal standing, a subject that has this kind of legal standing. It's a very interesting sort of tactic for thinking through the innovative ways that we might imagine, doing environmental politics differently, thinking about ecological scale and structures differently. And I don't know that it's not the solution perhaps to everything, but it is a kind of way of thinking outside the box in some form that allows us to kind of move beyond the usual tropes of politics that we're so used to operating in. So I think that there's some good examples out there of operating environmental activism in ways that are innovative and creative if we can continue to think in those dimensions.
Absolutely. And one of the trademark concerns in anthropology has been trying to deal in a critical way with the Cartesian dualisms. The mind matter, the nature culture kinds of dualisms, which have been so constraining, not only for our civilization, but for anthropology. And in this, Iceland is an interesting case because it's unusual. We usually get these sort of post-Cartesian perspectives on mountains and so on from indigenous peoples in the Peru and that sort of thing. So in this respect, Iceland is interesting. But Rasmus, would you say that some of the people you work with who clean debris and who try to sort of clean the creeks and the inlets of Stockholm, how would they sort of engage with nature as such? Do they see it as something outside of the human agency that we need to control, or something that we should realize that we're part of? What is their world? What does their world look like? Is it an engineering kind of world, or is it something else?
They have a little bit different views within the group, but I would say that the general consensus is that water is not something we should to govern or something like this, but that they don't try to look at water as a resource. They want to see water as something more and something that we can live together with, rather than trying to control or take use of and so on. But on the same hand, they're also depicting it as a resource in order to lobby their interest to politicians and this kind of stuff, because it's much easier to get some attention from the people above if you put it as a resource to save, for example, for drinking water and all this kind of stuff. So they are like pulling two separate agendas at once. One, when what they believe, and that it shouldn't be governed, it should be something we're just living with rather. And then one which in order to try to save or try to fix with it, to put it as a resource in order to gain some traction with the politicians and the general public, which actually knows it as a resource if you're looking at the UN Sustainable Development Goals and all that kind of stuff, but it's very, very framed in this kind of way. That's some research for drinking, a research for utility and so on. Yeah.
I mean, thank you. I mean, one main difference, I guess, between Denmark and the other sort of three countries under consideration here today, because we don't have anybody from Finland, is the fact that Denmark, I mean, at the end of the day, has far less, I think, pristine, untouched wilderness than any of the others after the loss of its empire. So this means that the Danish engagement with nature would by default perhaps be quite different from the one in Norway or Sweden, where you see the wilderness as something, you know, out there, possibly to be conquered, possibly to be controlled, possibly a source for metaphysical or even religious experience, which is quite common in this country. You know, the religion of Norwegians is not Christianity, it's nature. But they have to destroy it in order to enjoy it, of course, because they have to build roads and they have to have comfortable cabins, you know, with floor heating and carports and so on and so forth. So I wonder if either Steffen or Quentin would comment on this. Comparatively, the relationship of Denmark to nature in a country which doesn't really have much.
Steffen, you want to try? Oh.
You're the outsider, so you probably have the best view on that.
Outsider. I think that's maybe a Scandinavian thing also, but there is a strong nationalism in Denmark. So nature feels, despite everything, I agree with you, there is not much nature left. But what is left is really praised to a level that is incredible. You know, it's in all the national songs, it's, you know, so there is still, I mean, there is a very emotional attachment to the coast, the forest, the fields, even the fields, you know. So I wouldn't say, yeah, I mean, they kind of recreate what they are missing naturally in their culture somehow. I don't know exactly.
No, I agree. I think it's a matter of something that is not there, but has to be created. It's not out there to be destroyed, but it has to be actually preserved. Now, I don't know if you, Quentin, know, but in Copenhagen, there's a small nature reserve between sort of in an island called Amager to the south of the city center, and politicians, in order to fund the metro infrastructure of the whole city, they've indebted themselves, and now they need to sell out this land in the nature reserve to build houses and houses and houses, because there's an influx of people to the city. And that has raised a huge, you know, uproar, again, collective organization and pushback from people. And it's a really small area, in fact. And it's surprising how much people are engaged and go out and find endemic species of this or that frog and type of grass and whatnot, and how much noise they've actually managed to create. I mean, the whole municipal election 3 years ago was about that in many ways, and it's probably going to be again in the autumn. So, I mean, it's really interesting how strongly it figures, but how, you know, how not there it is, or how not natural, or, you know, there's nothing untouched in Denmark for sure. It's really nature is something you actually create, I think. But then I haven't, I mean, researched this myself, so I'm just, you know, I'm not a better you know, authority on this than many of you guys, I think.
There's an interesting comparison, I think, because there are some common patterns as well, and part of it is to do with Protestantism. Even if most of us no longer go to church, and many people don't believe in God, I mean, we're cultural Protestants, and there's a tendency to value that which is natural at the expense of that which is, you know, artificial or cultured, and so on and so forth. So the rewilding business that has started in some other countries probably not be quite as well taken here. I mean, and there is a duality in this quest for the natural. On the one hand, that there is a critical discourse around plastic surgery, for example, because you should be who you are and you should love yourself the way you are. and the way you were created in a way, unlike those decadent Brazilians and Koreans who, go to surgeons to look better. But on the other hand, there is also a quest for purity there that could spill over into other things, ethnic purity and so on, which we did have in a big way in a not too distant past. I wonder if anybody would like sort of to comment on this duality. Is there something here, Protestant purity, the sanctimoniousness that you sometimes see in Scandinavians is also part of this. We can solve everybody's problems. Just ask us and we'll solve your problems. Nobody wants to say anything. Okay, we can then easily move on. What are the main contradictions? This is a related issue. What are the main contradictions in the Nordic relationship to nature? Because we are consumerist societies. We're affluent. We consume a lot. We travel. At least we used to until March last year, but people will travel again. In Sweden, there is less air travel now, perceptibly less. I mean, Sweden is actually doing much better than a country like Norway when it comes to changing the way of life. But even so, we are consumerist societies, very affluent. And at the same time, there's a lot of song and dance about the way in which we are, we conserve and we fund, the planting of trees in the Amazon and so on and so forth. In Norway, it's very stark, the double bind in Norwegian society between the dependency on fossil fuels on the one hand and the attempt to appear as sustainable to the outside world. Yes, Steffen wants to begin, but anybody else jump in and...
No, I mean, the contradictions are certainly there. And I think that's also kind of what I pointed to in the beginning with reference to Kari Nørgaard's work. I mean, I think most people accept that climate change is happening and that we have a role to play in it. But at the same time, it's so very convenient to continue living the way we do and to, again, strategically stress the forms of agency that might not be affecting you as much. I mean, it's easy to blame the agricultural sector, it's easy to blame the tech sector, it's easy to blame, whatnot. I mean, and the Chinese and the Indians and, everyone else, right? I mean, again, Scandinavian countries are small, we're pure, we're not really emitting a lot, but at the same time, we import a lot of stuff, of course. And there are these critical voices that kind of point this out every now and then that, consumerism is a problem and how do we deal with that? I mean, how do we position ourselves and try to live maybe more sustainably as the one the people Quentin has worked with? I'm still thinking about the Protestant issue, Thomas. I'm kind of have a student researching it, but we're not really, might not be there yet to actually talk about it. But I might jump in later with that, if that's okay.
Dominic?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of say, I think you're right that there is something about the sort of Protestant relationship to nature that's going on here, and I would, in a slightly speculative way, say it leads to a certain sort of aestheticization of the natural that I think also is linked, at least in Iceland, as historians have explained it to us, really to a shift in the 19th century when the wilderness went from being a terrifying place that no right-minded person ever ventured into a place where it became a sort of increasingly, especially in the 20th century, a hallmark of one's modernity and privilege to go tramping across the glacial landscapes and to sort of get to commune with nature. And so nature became the land of fire and ice became, if you will, sort of an aspect of national culture or sort of a token of identity that people could center themselves around, and that it became a point of pride. And I don't know whether that's the same or different in other Nordic countries, but I do think that the question of purity that you raise, I think, is critical because one finds this also in a lot of Protestant environmentalist discourse elsewhere, like in the United States, the idea of the pristine wilderness that we can't let the indigenous people have anything to do with it because they don't know what they're doing. It has to be pristine. So we have to keep, Smokey the Bear was a kind of a racist symbol, policing symbol of sort of keeping people of Latinx background out of the wilderness where they were allegedly set fires. And I think there's a little bit of this that sort of continues on today. And so I think when we think about environmental preservation, I personally would not want to ever separate that from the politics of inclusion and exclusion. Who is allowed to sort of be the community for whom this that looks on this natural landscape and is allowed to connect to it. And so I think that is an issue, especially with the politics of migration in Scandinavia, that we probably need to talk more about.
Yes, I think we do, because there are some convergences, there are some pattern similarities. And if you just go back a little bit in history, you'll find that in the 1930s, I mean, the people who were enthusiastic supporters of eugenics and racial purity also loved nature, because of its purity. So there are some things here that haven't been properly addressed in the relationship, you might say, between the anti-racist and post-colonial struggle on the one hand, and the ecological struggle on the